All right, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Alan Jaglenzer at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, and I want to welcome you to the first webinar of a series of planned monthly webinars to support a live in-person disinformation summit that we were intending to host this summer, but we've deferred to the summer of 2023. Tonight's topic will be willful ignorance, delusion-like beliefs, and conspiracy theories, and I'll introduce our guest in a moment. I'm joined with Anna Mason, who is one of our MBA students here at University of Cambridge and who is celebrating the fact that she got through my course and survived my course in accounting, which is not the most favorite course in the Cambridge core. So Anna and I are going to work to moderate the questions. And so when we have questions from the audience, feel free to type them in and we'll interweave them through to Dr. Pierre when we get there. So the whole point of this webinar in our series is because, in my field, we're working with information and we're information scientists. And fundamentally, it led me to wonder, can we do interdisciplinary work and try to understand disinformation? Because in my mind, it seems to be acting currently as an accelerant for a bunch of, if you will, existential crises around the world. And so I thought it would be interesting for us to collectively get together and learn about disinformation and collaborate across disciplines. So our summit and our seminars will include people who come from psychiatry, psychology, from business, from accounting, included in business. We'll also bring in some political scientists and others, journalism, for example. And we're going to try to reach around the world and try to bring people in so that we can have more dialogue. Just to give you some perspective, the summit has an advisory board that is actually in some ways growing, and it's a collection of people who are affiliated with major news organizations, with major myth-busting organizations, with RAND Corporation, with universities around the world. And we're just fundamentally trying to learn from each other. And so this will be our group. And some of these folks will be coming in as speakers in the webinar series in the months ahead, and we'll be announcing them as we go forward. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Joe Pierre, who's offered to share time with us tonight. He's the Chief of Mental Health Community Care Systems at the VA West Los Angeles Healthcare Center and a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He graduated from MIT, the UCLA School of Medicine, and the residency training program at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. The way I found him was his work in writing. So he's authored over 100 papers, abstracts, and book chapters to include topics like schizophrenia, antipsychotic medications, substance-induced psychosis, and where we get into our topic tonight, delusions and delusion-like beliefs. And I found him via his blog, which is Psych Unseen for Psychology Today. So I wanted to welcome Dr. Pierre to our session. And I appreciate that you're going to be willing to spend time today with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and always interesting to be talking with people over Zoom, especially when you can't see their faces. So we'll make the best of technology and hopefully have a good discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. So I wanted to open it up and see whether you would actually start off with defining for us what you mean by a conspiracy belief and what led you to start doing work in that area.
Yeah, so let me actually back up for just a little while and maybe just say a few more words about myself, if you don't mind. So as you stated, I'm a psychiatrist. I do primarily, work with hospitalized patients, and my area of clinical focus has been patients who suffer from psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And one of the reasons I'm interested in psychotic disorders is because some of the symptoms of psychotic disorders, like delusions and hallucinations, are just very intriguing to me. And so I am a former researcher. I don't do as much research anymore. And my academic work over the years has really shifted away from psychosis per se to what I often refer to as the gray area between psychosis and normality. And in that zone, when we start talking about delusions, which are fixed and false beliefs, there's the gray area would be something that we call delusion-like beliefs. Beliefs that might on their surface sound delusional, but if we break them down into components or look at defining features of delusions, they fall short of that definition for one reason or another. And I think fairly clearly over the past couple of years, the best example of a delusion-like belief and the most relevant example in today's world are conspiracy theory beliefs. And so let me go ahead and try. I have a couple slides that I wanted to use, and let's see if I can get this to work well. Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Great. So I would preface my answer to your question about defining conspiracy theories by saying that we might argue that there is no one standard definition that every person who does work with conspiracy theories agrees upon. So I'm going to offer you a definition that I like to use, that I've written about in some of my work. And just reading here from the slide, it says, a conspiracy theory rejects the authoritative account of reality in favor of some plot involving a group of people with malevolent intent that's deliberately kept secret from the public. And just to round out this slide, there are a number of different examples. Let's see if I can get this to work. There's a number of different examples of conspiracy theories that have occurred over time. I think most of these occurred in our lifetime so that we have some familiarity with them. You can see on the top half, many of them relate to world or historical events, and many of them, particularly ones that we're encountering in current times, have to do with what I might refer to as scientific issues or scientific facts. So that's my answer about what I think of when I talk about conspiracy theories.
Thanks, Joe. I had a question. So you mentioned that it was more recently that your research moved into the grey area. What was it particularly that caused that trigger or change in your research?
Yeah, it's an interesting interesting question. I think, to be honest, if I go back in my own career evolution, one of the things that led me to psychiatry in the first place was really an attempt to understand human behavior more broadly. And my background at MIT as someone who was trained with a molecular biology background, I think I came away from that experience with the belief that one way to understand normal behavior is to understand abnormal behavior. That's a kind of principle that really formed the basis for what we learned about genetics, for example. Studying mutations tells us about how normal genes work. And so I think I took that spirit with me and took that to then go into studying, going to medical school and becoming a psychiatrist as a way to not only understand the more clear-cut pathological states, but really to understand the broader swath of behaviors that straddle that line. Incidentally, that is one of the big differences between psychiatry and psychology, which is a question I get all the time. What's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? And one of the big differences is that psychiatry really models itself as a medical discipline that focuses on disease states, or what we call mental disorders. Whereas psychology is a much broader discipline that does have some focus on abnormal or clinical psychiatry, but also strives to understand things like how the human perception works. And so I like to think of myself as sitting in between those two disciplines. And the title of my blog, for example, is Psych Unseen. It's a sort of play on words that gets on this idea that even in normal behavior, we see these undercurrents of psychiatric issues that are mirrored in more clear-cut cases of pathology. So hopefully that answers your question. I've sort of come full circle to where I think got me into the field in the first place, which is to really understand beyond just mental illness why we do things that we do.
And you said that often people will, look at the opposite. Did you learn anything then about normal behavior from this new direction then?
Well, I guess the way I think about it is one thing I'm fond of saying, for example, is that the idea that human beings think rationally and logically all the time is hopefully understood now to be a complete myth. So normal behavior does not involve rational thinking and evidence-based beliefs. And part of the message that I focus on in my writing is that many of the things that I'll be talking about today, which I sometimes refer to as cognitive quirks or psychological foibles, these are things that we all have. This is not a question of mentally ill people and not mentally ill people. In fact, some of my recent blog posts have gotten onto this issue. I don't know if it's quite reached the UK, but this idea that large proportions of the population are suffering from mass delusions or mass psychosis. And I really want to get away from that idea of sort of othering this behavior. These are normal human brain processes that lead us to be vulnerable to adopting false beliefs and often defending them quite passionately, despite the fact that they're false.
So thanks, Joe. I want to reach out and introduce Professor Mark Duran. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about, introduce yourself too?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Thank you for being here and for starting off this series, really. So I'm very curious, right? So I've spent the last 3 years trying to work in what one might call an epistemologically closed community, existentially closed world, which is mostly online, but also has an offline component to it. And one of the questions that I've worried about is the following: how can you best engage, if at all, with people that seem to inhabit very different epistemological worlds, that to them make sense, even if they don't make any sense to me. Now, turning up the volume doesn't work. We know that reasoning doesn't work. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas from your own experience or field work on what is likely to be kind of more effective rather than less effective.
Yeah, a great question. I'll answer it in part by way of just a little bit of somewhat personal experience with that. Part of how I first got into thinking about conspiracy theories and being curious about them started some years ago when I think it was the NBA basketball player Kyrie Irving had come out in the press talking about flat Earth ideas. And I think after I had written about that, some movie directors had come and approached me to consult and to do interviews on a documentary film they were making about flat earthers. And I think I only made it into the movie for about 4 minutes or so, but we talked extensively as a part of that interview. And part of what I was doing was answering that very question, which was how, as documentarians, could they meet with people within the flat Earth community, learn about what they believe, why they believed it, and really not be seen as someone who was making fun of them or denigrating them in some fashion. And so what we talked about, and the same answer I'll give you now, goes back to what I said about really normalizing these kinds of beliefs rather than othering. People who have conspiracy theory beliefs or other types of beliefs, by definition, are not, I shouldn't say by definition, are by and large not people with mental illness. We all share vulnerabilities to false beliefs. And that's really, I think, the attitude we have to go into when we talk to people who have beliefs that differ from us. Not, this is a crazy person and isn't that fascinating and I'm going to learn about them, but rather really trying to understand what the process is that gives rise to those beliefs. Now, I'm sure with some other questions, I'll get into some of the research that's been done that answers that question of why. But the framework that I've written about in my academic work that I think gets at this very issue is what I call a two-component theory. And the first part is about mistrust of informational sources. And there is a wide range of reasons why we might mistrust informational sources, some of which are more what I might call legitimate in cases of lost trust or earned mistrust. Some of them are cases which perhaps are not as earned or justified. And when we mistrust in informational sources, what that does is it then leaves us vulnerable to the vast amount of misinformation and deliberate disinformation that's out there. And for me, I think that framework is one that really helps me understand and potentially dialogue and meet with people who have these divergent beliefs, rather than just writing them off as someone who's crazy, for example.
Thank you, Joe. That's really helpful. Would you allow me to follow up with one question, because I know there's something in the chat log. And there's a bit of personal background to this, but I'm wondering what it is that keeps people engaged with a particular set of or single conspiracy theory. And I'm thinking particularly in the context of, say, cults. I'm assuming that's probably part of the larger umbrella sort of conspiracy theories, and and sometimes at great personal cost. People will stick with it, so to speak, and sometimes pay the ultimate price or end up paying the ultimate price. I'm thinking of, say, the Branch Davidians, for example, in the 1990s. Any thoughts on why it is that even as not only counter arguments, but events happen on the outside that in some ways should take the sting out of the conspiracy belief, they don't seem to be effective, and so people pay huge prices personally to just stay with it.
Yeah, so I have two responses. The first is that when we get away from just thinking about individuals who have beliefs and thinking about groups who have beliefs, then we have to think more about let's call it the risks and benefits of having those beliefs. And so previous research on so-called cults, I don't really like to use that term, and we can get into why, but when we talk about those sort of closed groups, as you say, what seems to be fairly apparent is that despite the potential negative impact of conspiracy beliefs or other kinds of delusion-like beliefs, there is a significant benefit from the group affiliation. And we're seeing that now even with online groups, right? They don't have to be a classic cult where someone's sequestered in some sort of compound the way the Branch Davidians were. These can even be online social media networks. And so the reality is that despite the cost that one incurs for this belief relative to mainstream society, there's a huge potential benefit to this newfound affiliation with perhaps a closed but also tighter knit, smaller group that one is able to enjoy through that affiliation. And so that's really what's being weighed in that sort of calculus. And there is certainly some evidence. I don't want to use this as a sort of overarching stereotype too much, but there is certainly some evidence that when we talk about so-called cults, a lot of the people who do end up in those situations are people who were socially isolated in one way or another. So when they then affiliate with this new group, that is enormously powerful and allows them to have that cognitive dissonance where even though their belief might diverge from facts or mainstream thinking, there's a benefit that then gets folded into the way people cognitively process those beliefs. Let's see. I'm trying to remember back to your other to your full question. I know there were two components I was going to speak on, but I've sort of lost my train of thought on what you were asking.
So I think you've mostly answered it, actually, Joe. I think the other component might have been, as the evidence piles up and should take this thing out.
Right. Yeah.
Sort of doesn't. And maybe part of the answer as well, because in conspiracy theories, everything can kind of be interpreted in the context of the theory and just helps feed it. And maybe that's the answer. I don't know. But, yeah.
Well, it also goes back to why I like to model this as an issue of mistrust and misinformation, because we often say, well, rational thinking or logic doesn't work. And I agree to a certain extent, but I think what we have to understand is that people who have conspiracy theory beliefs or delusion-like beliefs, in a sense, they're thinking rationally. I think the real conundrum that we face in today's world is that we have fundamentally different definitions of evidence, or for that matter, of facts. So it's not like the delusional patient who believes that they're Jesus Christ or something because they dreamt it, and while they were sleeping an angel came and told them, right? A sort of core purely subjective experience. That's really not what we're talking about with delusional-like beliefs, and this is where disinformation and misinformation become prominent. I often say that I don't actually like the term conspiracy theorist, because most people who have conspiracy theory beliefs are not theorizing. They're not coming up with hypotheses and testing them. They're mistrusting and then going to sources, whether online or otherwise, and finding evidence that supports what they believe. That's not irrational per se. It's this fundamental disagreement on what you say isn't evidence, what I say is evidence, and this sort of inability to bridge that gap.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to piggyback on a couple of the comments that are in the Q&A, which is something core to me. It seems that a lot of this delusion-like belief is stemming from predatory behavior. So there's somebody out there who's fundamentally predatory, or there are groups out there who are trying to manipulate this vulnerable population. So I'm curious if you can speak to the psychology of the predator and why people become so vulnerable to that, because that's what I'm observing out in the field.
Right. So let's go back to distinguishing. I think this is somewhat common knowledge now, but let's distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. So that distinction usually entails misinformation basically just being information that's not accurate or that's false, but disinformation really having a deliberate component of perhaps involving one being aware that what the information they're spreading is false, but doing it anyway for some, in psychiatry, we call this secondary gain, for some external motive. And I think very clearly when we talk about conspiracy theories, it's very clear that the disinformation component is quite prominent. And there's many different examples, whether we're talking about beliefs within the anti-vaccine movement or political beliefs, where the, again, so-called evidence for the beliefs is put out there with some ulterior motive or some external purpose, which of course is kind of a conspiracy theory in and of itself, right? I often say that the conspiracy theorists are often blind to some of the real conspiratorial elements of the source of the information that they're relying on. So yeah, I think that's a huge problem, particularly when we start talking about politics, but also, as you mentioned, about business and profits. And one of the things that has come out of information science research over the past several years that I think, again, is probably common knowledge at this point, is that false information, so-called fake news, travels farther, faster, more broadly than reliable information. And because of that, then provides a financial incentive for people to spread that misinformation. I myself am on social media, and I often think sometimes that probably the best way I'm going to get clicks and attention to what I say is by saying something that really pisses people off or that is just flat out wrong. And now I try not to do that, but I see other examples of that happening. So there really is a motive and a benefit to being someone who spreads misinformation. And I don't think that's necessarily a psychological thing. I think that's more in your domain. That's a profiteering motive. As far as the consumer end, I think that does relate to the way information has evolved over the course of our lifetimes. I often talk about how when I was a kid, our family subscribed to one newspaper, the major city paper. When I had assignments to do something called a book report, I don't know if people even do those anymore, or kids do those anymore, but I had to bike down to the library and check out books or reference this thing called the Encyclopedia Britannica to get my information. And that's just not the world we live in now. And I think that to a certain extent, the generation that grew up with this new informational landscape was really never taught how to sift through that information. How do you judge what's reliable or not? What sources are biased or not? These are all things that we talk about now, but I feel like, and I admittedly haven't been to elementary school in 40 years, but I don't get the sense that these are things that we're teaching current generations. And for that matter, older people as well. We know that older people are particularly vulnerable to so-called fake news. And I think that's in part because they also never learned about this new technology and have just come to regard it by the same standards that we used to regard information that we encountered in the media.
I think that point on tackling misinformation is really interesting and something we'll get into later on the talk. I just want to field some questions that are coming in, and maybe going back to what you were saying about an online cult. It would be, interesting to hear more from you on what that looks like. And also, do you think that social media has become a major catalyst for this reason of disinformation, particularly recently?
Well, so let's see, tackle both parts of that question. So I mentioned earlier, I'm not fond of using the word cult. I think it has a place. I think that we run into difficulties sometimes when we get in the habit of labeling too many different group phenomenon as cults. If we really break down defining features of cults, which might include a kind of coercive element or a a kind of closed system. It's been argued that those are features of a lot of mainstream groups, including mainstream religions. So I don't like to use that term. That said, I do think that it is relevant to talk about informational systems, social media, echo chambers, filter bubbles. I think these are all very relevant to the way we affiliate with other people, how we learn information, how we adopt our beliefs, how we reinforce those beliefs, how we then view other people who disagree with us. And these are things that were just very different, again, to three decades ago when I was growing up. So I don't want to overplay or overstate the impact of social media or being online. That said, I think it's also undeniable that has really radically reshaped the way that we form beliefs and we develop relationships with other people who either share or are in opposition to those beliefs.
So thank you. I'm going to ask a question from the audience. It looks like there are two that are somewhat related. One question is asking, how do we distinguish between conspiracy theories and then situations where group genuinely harbor malevolent intentions towards each other? And then relatedly, there's one asking about conspiracy theories that are directly damaging and harmful versus those that are fundamentally harmless, like flat earthers was the example in the latter. Is this distinction relevant?
All right, so you might have to, that's a long question. You might have to remind me of the first part later, but let me address the second part. So absolutely, I think there's a relevant distinction. It's not so much a definitional distinction, but I think there's a meaningful distinction between the impact of not just conspiracy theory beliefs, but beliefs in general. So that yes, in terms of not believing that the earth is round, that arguably doesn't have a lot of major functional impact. That said, there was this case here in the US of someone who allegedly believed that the earth was flat and built a rocket ship that he was going to shoot himself up into the stratosphere to prove that the earth was flat, and he died because the rocket crashed. So, and there's a deeper backstory or a more complicated backstory to that. But even something that is pretty trivial, seemingly trivial on the surface, could be more impactful. That all said, I would definitely agree that there are certain domains of conspiracy theory belief, particularly ones that we're seeing right now, that really deserve to be, that deserve our concern. And I think those are, when I showed the slide before and divided conspiracy theory beliefs about historical events and what I'm calling scientific issues, I think we really run a pretty significant negative impact when we start talking about conspiracy theory beliefs related to science. Again, anti-vaccine conspiracy theory beliefs, probably the most palpable and relevant example right now, but also beliefs related to climate change, beliefs historically related to HIV and AIDS, where basically because of mistrust in those informational sources and embracing these conspiratorial narratives, people are turning away from medical care, for example, that's helpful, or turning away from addressing issues of climate change that, arguably, you mentioned existential, right? Arguably the most existential issue that we'll be facing, at least in our children's lifetimes. So I think there are meaningful distinctions there. They're not definitional distinctions, but I think the scope or the focus of the conspiracy theory belief is indeed very important. And another way to answer that is that a common question is whether or not we're living in some sort of golden age of conspiracy theories. And I'll just refer to another researcher here in the US named Joe Yasinski. He's a political scientist, and he has probably done more work than anyone else, along with his colleagues, of trying to address this question of whether conspiracy theory beliefs are more common. So I'll answer that by saying, number one, we don't have good data to answer that question. It's not like we've been doing surveys of conspiracy theory beliefs over the past several centuries. But the available information that we have is probably not. Actually, conspiracy theories have been around since the dawn of civilization. They've been extremely relevant and have resulted in significant world events throughout the course of history. That all said, I do think an argument can be made that we're living in a time where conspiracy theory beliefs are more relevant and more potentially destructive than they have in the course of any of our lifetimes. And again, I'll take it back to what I said before about conspiracy theory beliefs related to the pandemic or to vaccines or to climate change and those sorts of things.
Great. And Mark, so Joe, sorry, we've spoken a bit about the how. It'd be great to just take a step back and look at the why. Specifically, could you explain the science behind humans wanting to believe certain pieces of information?
Yeah, let me go back and try to share screen and do a slide. Hopefully I'll do it correctly this time. So this is a slide that gets at a brief summary of research, primarily from psychology over the past decade or 2 decades, about associational differences. That is, if you divide people into those who believe conspiracy theories versus those who tend not to, are there differences that we can pinpoint on a psychological level? And there are indeed a number of different themes that have come out of numerous studies looking at this. And I should plug other people, including some very prominent researchers there in the UK, like Karen Douglas or Dan Jolly, who are doing this kind of work. So some of the findings from that research, they've summarized as saying this is related to psychological needs. And so some of the psychological needs that seem relevant to why people might embrace conspiracy theories, here's the first one: need for certainty, control, or closure. This is an idea that conspiracy theories, despite their conspiratorial nature, or even at times their outlandish nature, sometimes they do provide a kind of tidy narrative that helps us make sense of the world. I think this is particularly true during the pandemic, where even now, two years into it or 3 years into it, but certainly in the early part of the pandemic, there was just so much we didn't understand about this new global threat, and a kind of pandemic threat that we have not experienced in our lifetimes. So in that sense, conspiratorial narratives sometimes can provide a relief to that anxiety of not knowing. So that's one finding that's been found from psychology research. Need for uniqueness is another one. This is the idea that people sometimes gravitate towards conspiracy theories because they feel like now they are among the privileged few who really understands the true nature of the world and what's going on in it, whereas the rest of us are blind, we're sheep, we've been blue-pilled, this sort of thing. And there's something sort of stimulating about being privy to that information. There are also different psychological traits that have been associated with conspiracy theory beliefs, certain attribution biases, for example, something called hypersensitive agency detection or teleologic bias. This, in a nutshell, can be summed up by saying this is a need we have that some of us have more than others to attribute higher causes to events rather than accepting that things happen by chance or by random or by coincidence. So people who are more likely to read into meanings or connect the dots, as it were, are more likely to believe in conspiracy theory beliefs. There is also, again, I don't want to overplay this idea of mental illness. That's not really what we're talking about here. But people who have a kind of paranoid worldview, the idea that the world is a threatening place, that people aren't to be trusted, that we're in danger, those kind of things, as we might expect, have overlap with people who have conspiracy theory beliefs. There's been recent research, primarily by a psychologist named Gordon Pennycook here in the US, on something that's actually called bullshit receptivity. And it turns out there's a number of different definitions of bullshit. The one that Pennycook uses is something called pseudo-profound bullshit, the idea that some of us tend to derive meaning, tend to perceive profoundness in statements that actually aren't really very meaningful at all. That's another psychological trait that's associated with conspiracy theory ideation, and helps to explain why sometimes even though the internal logic of conspiracy theories doesn't always make sense, that might still be appealing to some consumers nonetheless. And the antithesis of much of what we're talking about is analytical thinking. So another way of saying that rather than antithesis is that the antidote to conspiratorial thinking is analytic thinking. So if we possess lower levels of analytical thinking, that seems to place us at greater vulnerability to conspiracy theory belief. And conversely, if we have greater levels of analytical thinking, then that is somewhat protective. And I think that's a very important point, because unlike many of the other cognitive foibles that I've reviewed on this slide, analytical thinking really, I think, should be thought of as a skill rather than an individual trait. Analytical thinking is a learnable skill. And in fact, mostly what analytical thinking really entails, and this is where it relates to misinformation, is slowing down. Instead of immediately seeing a tweet and saying, yeah, this makes sense and I'm going to share it, slowing down and saying, wait a minute, maybe this is bullshit. Maybe it's not right. Maybe there is some third party who has an ulterior motive. And thinking through that and thinking, maybe this is not correct information. And then looking more deeply at the evidence. So I think that's really a good way of understanding what are some of the things that can protect us against conspiratorial beliefs. But analytical thinking, I want to make clear, even though it's a skill, it is not an intuitive one. And particularly when we start talking about science, it's much the same way. The scientific method is not an intuitive way that human beings think. It's something that we're taught. And I would argue that we're not taught all that well, from grade school up, those of us who don't become scientists. So anyway, that's my overview to answer this sort of question of why are people drawn to this? There's no one reason. And I should make clear that all of the things that are on this slide, like need for uniqueness, those are needs that we all have. So this is a really question of degree and magnitude, rather than saying, oh, all conspiracy theory believers have needs for closure. Well, we all have needs for closure, but relative to those who believe conspiracy theories and don't, these are quantitative differences that we see.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Joe. It's interesting because I'm going to segue a little bit. We'll circle back to some of the questions too, but I'm going to segue a little bit into prevention. I know in Finland, since you said critical thinking, they're actually training that into the grade schools, but it leads me to a comment you actually wrote, something along the lines of those who most need to understand or have to have critical thinking or are the most unwilling to accept it. And so I'm wondering, how is it possible to get critical thinking skills in or get extra data? And if so, how does one get that across to people?
Yeah, it's to a certain extent is certainly the $1 million question. I think clearly, as I said before, it's a teachable skill. It's a learnable skill. The question then is, how do we motivate someone to learn that skill? And I think, I referenced this earlier about in education these days, not really being taught about how to determine what's a reliable or not a reliable source. So I think part of the solution really has to be from the ground up, starting at an early age, really teaching people how to navigate the informational landscape that's out there. I'll give you another example that I often use. This is another reference to just me being old, basically. But my experience growing up was it's not as if misinformation didn't exist, but in a kind of cartoonish way, we knew that misinformation was, for one thing, kind of sequestered into the grocery store checkout line. And that's where we saw the National Enquirer, or I know that there's comparable examples there in the UK. Or the Weekly World News. I actually at one point subscribed to the Weekly World News. This was a newspaper that would talk about space aliens and this sort of thing, discovering ancient Atlantis under the ocean. But we recognized that for what it was. We recognized it, for the most part. When I say we, I mean most people recognized it as being false, and we recognized it as being entertainment. And nowadays, the informational landscape we live in doesn't have those clear boundaries. Much of what we consume is online through our cell phones. It's no longer that we're getting a subscription news service delivered to our door every morning. And so I think that's really the key. But it also points to what a difficult task that is, sort of revamping education from the ground up. I'll put in another plug to some folks doing this kind of work here in the US. There's a college course being taught at, I hope I get this right, University of Washington, by a guy named Carl Bergstrom and Geffen They created a college course called Calling Bullshit. I believe their URL is callingbullshit.org. This is a college level course that's taught specifically about recognizing, they call it kind of new age or new world bullshit. It's really teaching data reasoning skills, how to look at numerical data, how to look at research data and decide, is this something that makes sense that I should believe in, or is this something that I should reject? They have their online, or they have their course syllabus online. It's there for anyone to see. So if you were a college, you could adapt that or adapt it to your what you're trying to do. But we have a kind of blueprint to do it. The question, whether looking at Finland or these places, is, how are we going to make it, how are we going to motivate educational systems to take this on and really do it? And I must say that I'm enough of a kind of free market person that I do favor that solution more so than, say, trying to regulate social media networks and that sort of thing. I think that really the money is making us better consumers of misinformation, rather than trying to have governments take over what information is out there with some wiggle room.
It sort of leads on to my next question. I was going to ask, have you seen any other examples like that of Finland, where maybe at a more of a state level, attempts are being made to tackle misinformation?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I see a lot of that. I'm going to call it kind of grassroots. A year or so ago, I was invited to give some talks for some organizations here in the U.S. that are really trying to teach science to young people, but not just in schools, in communities, and not just children, adults. And I must say that I think oftentimes when I think about the problem of belief in misinformation or conspiracy theories, I often do have a kind of cynical idea about, are we really going to get beyond this or solve this? But I must say, when working with those groups and lecturing with those groups, I was really pretty inspired to see that there are some kind of grassroots, from the ground up efforts that are being done on community levels to teach analytical thinking, to teach people really what science is about, and to get people to question their own beliefs and think about things in a more rational or evidence-based way. So I think there's room for it. I think those efforts are happening. That said, what I'm not seeing outside of Finland is really whole-scale efforts at a government or sort of overarching level. And I think it would be great if we did see more of that.
As a quick follow-up, how do you feel about fact-checking organizations and the value of that? Or in our business, we have audit, for example. How do you feel about those?
Well, I think I'm a firm believer in them. I don't know if this is maybe an obscure reference that I shouldn't bother mentioning, but I can't help but mention the free association. So back when I think it was George Bush II was running for office here in the US, and Dick Cheney was running as his vice president, Dick Cheney made a sort of gaffe during one of the debates where he mentioned, I think it was factcheck.org. And he meant to reference a different website that had a similar name. And it actually took us to the fact-check.org that we know now, which is the reliable fact-checking organization, which actually refuted the things that he was claiming. So actually, that was one of my first exposures to fact-checking. And I think they're great. I think that what's interesting, and particularly when we talk about political debates, is I think many consumers have actually come to rely on those. All right, we watch, at least here in the US, we watch a presidential debate, and then we'll watch an hour's worth of commentary thereafter that says, well, this person lied 40% of the time, and this person lied 30% of the time. So I think those are vital mechanisms to keep us honest. That all said, going back to what I said about mistrust and misinformation, there's a limit to how effective those are. And oftentimes, if you try to counter what people believe with, oh, this has been fact-checked, they will again just say, well, I don't believe that fact-checking. I assume in the UK that some people are familiar with this site called Snopes, Snopes.com, which is a long-standing, before the internet fact-checking service. And many people say, no, well, I don't believe Snopes. They're liberally biased. They're connected to this, that, and the other thing. And so I don't trust that as an informational source. So even though I think fact checking has an important role, there's still this problem of people not believing fact checkers and this sort of concept of who's checking the fact checkers.
Joe, if I may, just looking at the Q&A, which is very rich in terms of the questions, a number of questions address the relation between religion and conspiracy theorizing, which will come at no surprise to you, and it might be slightly controversial. So I suspect the twofold question here might be, number one, to what extent would you consider the major world religions a version of a conspiracy theory? Sorry to put you on the spot. An extension of that would be, I suppose, if analytical reasoning is a way out, and so to speak, how can you reconcile that with something that is probably true of most world religions, which is that everything ultimately makes sense in the context of that existential world, and so analytical reason may not actually help because everything is given a place and everything would be the way it is, so we think it is, if the conspiracy theory or the religion were true.
Yeah, this is actually a topic that I'm very interested in. Actually, one of the first academic papers I ever wrote tackled this very issue of really focusing on how can we distinguish between delusional beliefs that are really part of mental illness, and certain religious beliefs. So just to be clear about this, I want to make clear, first of all, that my position is that religious beliefs are, by and large, 100% normal. These are all, most of us have some type of religious belief. Even atheism is a religious belief of sorts. And it goes back to what we said about the impact of beliefs. I think that for the most part, religious beliefs, regardless of getting into whether or not they're accurate or not, are healthy. I think their impact on civilization through the millennia has been certainly not uniformly positive, but I think certainly there have been many positives in art and literature and what have you that have come from religious belief. That said, we also know that religious beliefs spawned the Crusades. We also know that there are individuals these days, you mentioned the Branch Davidians, who take religious beliefs to a certain level where they start endorsing violence or other harmful impacts start to happen. Again, trying to think back to your question, I think there are some meaningful distinctions. I also would say that I don't think that most religious beliefs are conspiratorial in nature per se. I think the question is, are they false or not? And even when I was a child, having had some awareness of world religions, one of the take-homes for me was, well, we know that not all religious beliefs are accurate, right? Because they contradict each other. So, okay, maybe this one's right and this one isn't, but we know that at least some people are wrong. And for me, what I often say is that when I talk about a mentally healthy way of holding beliefs, that the healthiest way to hold a belief, I also say that beliefs should be thought of ultimately as probability judgments. And the healthiest way to hold a probability judgment is with what we might call cognitive flexibility. And there is a distinction between belief and faith, right? There's also this paradox of faith that we tend sometimes to believe most passionately in things that we have the least amount of evidence for. The author, Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, talked about no one is passionately shouting every day, like, the sun is going to come up this morning. I know it is. Like, we just know it's going to. The things that we passionately believe in and throw our weight behind and argue about are the things for which there's uncertainty. And so the mentally healthy way to hold a belief is to acknowledge that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have faith. I can say, I believe that this is God, and I'm going to worship that God, and I'm going to go to church every Sunday, and I'm going to do whatever. But the healthy way is to say, I acknowledge that you have a different belief about that God. And you know what? Maybe you're right, and that's cool, but I'm going to put my eggs in this basket. And I'm not going to think that you need to be done away with, or I shouldn't declare war on your country for having that belief. So I think that's a meaningful distinction. I also think when we talk about analytical thinking, look, the fact of the matter is that most people, when they hear something like analytical thinking, they just think like boring, like, what do I want to think analytically for? And the reality is that that only gets us so far as human beings. There's enormous meaning in fiction, in myths, mythology, and those play an important role. And so I think we have to be able to resolve, I'm not suggesting that we should all just become scientists and think rationally. I don't think that's a healthy way to live. But I do think that it's healthy to be able to understand that some of the things we feel most confident about are probably not as evidence-based, and be able to think flexibly and to respect other people's beliefs about those things.
So just looking at some of the questions that we've got coming in. One question is about susceptibility to misinformation. So someone's asked, are there any reliable sources out there where someone could maybe test themselves and perhaps benchmark themselves?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, of course, because I will acknowledge I have my own biases, politically or otherwise. So some of the things that I might endorse might indeed be different than someone else. So part of the way I answer that is actually to say that part of the solution, particularly in today's media landscape, is not to be confined to one or a handful of informational sources. I made this comparison to when I was growing up and we just subscribed to the one metropolitan newspaper that came onto our doorstep. I'm not suggesting we go back to that. I think it's a real value to have a diversity of informational sources. I think what we need to understand better are things like the media bias chart that says, well, here's all the different informational sources, and this one leads more to the left, this one leads more to the right, these ones cluster in the middle versus this one being like way out there. And we should really understand that, and we should acknowledge our own biases and not just read the things that support us, right? I haven't mentioned confirmation bias today, but I feel like that's become a household word, but that's so crucially important when we talk about exposure and vulnerability to misinformation, right? Confirmation bias, of course, is this idea that all of us are vulnerable to when we search for answers or we're quote unquote doing our own research. We gravitate to information that supports our preconceived notion or our pre-existing beliefs, and we steer away and steer clear of information that refutes it. That's really unhealthy. And so we need to be better about exposing ourselves to information that contradicts what we say, and being able to go back to more analytical ways to look at that, but also having dialogues with people, and not on Twitter or Facebook or online, not dialogues like that, having dialogues where you're actually, metaphorically breaking bread with people, and meeting as a community to talk through different perspectives. I think that's really where the money lies in terms of being able to take on other people's beliefs and have cognitive flexibility, is through personal relationships and not trying to attempt that online.
So thanks. I'm also going to the audience. I'm going to twist this a little bit. It seems as there are some governments or government actors, I should say, who are trying to prevent critical thinking, who are trying to prevent the opportunity to bring dialogue together, and who actually exploit divisiveness and disinformation. How does one penetrate that?
Yeah, well, I would certainly agree with that statement, and particularly when we start talking about the use of misinformation and disinformation for political motives. I think the way you penetrate it, at least in theory, is just doing what you just said, which is acknowledging that that's something that's happening now, and that those efforts are indeed ongoing. Again, there's many, Russia and the disinformation network of Russia, of course, is a good example where there are clear instances where misinformation has a very clear motive. And I think when we talk about a place like the US, or certainly in the UK and with Brexit and all that, I think there's pretty good evidence that some of the reasons why, for example, Brexit was passed, or here in the US, why there's political division, is that I think there's good evidence that there was a coordinated effort to split apart a country, to erode aspects of democracy, to inhibit our ability to have those dialogues. And I think having that awareness that there are various forces. I mean, it is sort of ironic, right? Because this is a kind of conspiracy theory, but being aware that there's these forces out there that are trying to manipulate us, and they're trying to drive us apart from our neighbors, as it were, or family members, there really is a motive behind that. And understanding that, I think, potentially gives us a little bit of a motivation to say, okay, maybe again, I should slow down and think about things a little bit more carefully rather than just, again, reinforcing confirmation bias.
So moving on to another question, is there a role for regulation to minimize the spread of disinformation, or is it too late? So I guess the argument that is it too hard to undo the work that's been done?
Yeah, I don't think it's almost never too late. We are talking about climate change, so maybe there's that. But I think there's always room for reform and retooling things. And I'm going to, I'm stepping outside of my area of expertise as a mental health professional to talk a little bit more about information science and things like government regulation. So this is sort of more opinion based. But I mentioned before that I am, roughly speaking, a proponent of free markets. So I'm not a huge fan of overzealous attempts at regulation. I think that what we have to figure out is, particularly for those of us who are trying to spread accurate information, is how can we do a better job of that? How can we sort of win in the informational free market where it's that being a purveyor of accurate information is actually profitable? How can we disincentivize, without regulation per se, being a purveyor of false information? I think part of the solution is there. And the reality, and this is something I think that those of us in science are increasingly aware of, is that we're not always good at packaging information. Part of the reason people mistrust institutions of authority is that historically there's often an attitude of, we're an institution of authority, here's what truth is, right? And that doesn't work. We have to be able to engage in dialogues with people. We have to let them in the door, so to speak, give them a seat at the table, where we're really talking with people about why we believe this. And when I say we, I'm talking about institutions of authority, whether it's news agencies or medical institutions, what have you. So again, I see this solution there being more potentially effective than regulation. That all said, I do think that there's a kind of fundamental framing that's misleading, this idea that if we don't allow certain voices to be heard, whether it's on social media or otherwise, that represents censorship. Look, the reality is that when we're talking about things like social media platforms, these are private institutions. This is not a government-run agency. This is not a place where those companies are beholden to let everyone say whatever they want to. I think that has to be understood when we talk about regulation or censorship. So that's the flip side, is that's not, I don't think, reflective of reality. But I think the more complicated question again is, how do we get those, whether it's social media or other informational sources, to be better so that we're packaging accurate information that people say, that makes so much sense, I'm going to believe that instead of this other source.
So I was hoping to spend a minute on something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is those people who are unwilling to hear alternative perspectives. So hypothetically, if I were to bring somebody to you as a patient who I believe needs, if you will, for lack of a better term, an intervention, is that even feasible? How would you treat that? Is it treatable? How does one reach somebody unwilling to be reached?
Yeah, I sort of have a slide on there, but I think it'll be too difficult to pull up. But I often refer to this perhaps familiar, perhaps not familiar joke that says something to the effect of, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. So I'm always very careful when I answer this question, because again, first of all, I don't think this is a mental health issue. When we talk about conspiracy theory beliefs or anti-vaxxers or what have you, this isn't like I need to prescribe more antipsychotic medications or get people into therapy. I don't think the solution is there. And there has to be a motive for somebody to have that cognitive flexibility, to understand that there's differing opinions. Somebody has to bring them on the couch, so to speak, whether it's with a mental health professional or just whoever. So I think we have to think about that. It goes back to what you asked earlier about, are there some of these beliefs that really have a negative impact? And that's often what brings people in to see a mental health professional, is that they feel like their life isn't going well. They're not talking to their family anymore because they believe that Like that's the sort of foot in the door to then start talking through these issues. And if you're ever going to make any progress with someone like that, in a situation like that, it goes back to this trust issue, right? No one's going to make any progress in a therapeutic setting or even outside of therapy, just with our family members or whoever, unless there's a fundamental position of starting with a trusting relationship. And that, again, it hinges upon not perceiving me or whoever we're talking about as a threat, as being critical, of belittling that person, and if we can start from there, then we can start exploring questions like, well, where do you get your information from? How do you decide what to trust or not? And really trying to unpack that as a potential way to move people into change. But the real problem is that for the most part, people aren't help seeking in that way, right? People who have these beliefs aren't saying, I should go see a psychiatrist, right? So the question is, how do we then do that on a sort of larger scale outside of mental health in the ways that we've sort of touched upon?
And with these people that you have worked with, typically how long can it take for you to build trust with someone and really feel like you've managed to turn a corner, or is every situation different, which I imagine it is?
Well, there's a sort of paradox again, where the people who are sort of less likely to change, right? Going back to the light bulb, they're never going to see me. The people who see me are the people who there's something that brought them there, an area of distress in their life. And maybe if I pinpoint that it is related to the themes we're talking about today, certain beliefs, then eventually we can get there. So there's a sort of kind of stage like how I have a model. Actually, let me see if I can pull it up since we're talking about it. A little bit difficult to do this simultaneously. Sorry, I'm going to give up. It's too difficult for me to talk and click at the same time. But I have a kind of model where I talk about different stages of ideological affiliation or ideological investment, right? So the kind of starting at baseline is someone who's a non-believer. The next step is someone who's a fence sitter, someone who is on the fence. They don't know, should I believe this? Should I not? I don't know if I trust this, and maybe I trust this. Then we go up to the true believer stage, somebody who's pretty committed to that belief. Beyond that, we have an activist, which I'm purposely not using a term like a radical or a terrorist or something like that, because there are different levels of activism. Some are healthy, some are not healthy. And so the ability to work with somebody in change is really going to depend on where they are in that stepwise stage. And it's not like people progress linearly through that stage. They might, jump over a stage and be a true believer, skipping over being a fence sitter. So anyway, the idea is that where one sits on that ideological continuum, that amount of investment is going to determine A, how likely they are to change, but also the kind of interventions we might want to use for somebody. And I think we can look to, I guess we'd call it the political science literature of so-called radicalization or terrorism, about how do we change beliefs like that. The answer, the evidence-based answer, is not convincing people of this, that, and the other thing. It's actually providing support for people, whether it's employment, whether it's social supports, which is whether it's changing the structure of society so that people can better integrate with society at large rather than being an outcast. Like that's where the money is at in terms of altering the beliefs of the people who are deeper along that stage-wise progression of ideological development.
It's really helpful, Joe. Thank you. I just picking up on some of the sentiment that's in the Q&A and the chat log. So I'm wondering, thinking back on the slide that you showed us of the head featuring a brain and sort of different reasons why people might take on certain beliefs, and the idea that belief itself, of course, sounds very cognitive and it foregrounds cognition. We've talked about analytical reasoning skills. I'm just wondering whether we're at risk of missing a trick, because I wouldn't at all be surprised if most conversion experiences in the broad sense, so not just conversion to religion, but conversion to any belief system, is much less cognitive than we assume it to be. And I think to some extent you've hinted at that already in what you've said, where conversion experiences, I think, might be much more embodied than that. And that belief may only be, or reasoning might only be a tiny, tiny part of what actually happens. And therefore, I think what you've just said about the importance of, in some ways, being a human being in the context of other human beings and relating to them, providing a social context for people that might reconvert them to something else is actually potentially quite powerful. So I'm not sure what the question is. I think I'm just looking at the chat log and sort of trying to piggyback on what you've just said. Again, with all the emphasis on analytical reasoning, are we missing a trick perhaps? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah, well, I think it at least in part goes back to what I was saying previously about when we talk about group belief rather than just thinking about the individual. So I think for sure there's a cognitive component where we're talking about individuals, but there's a whole different scope of forces that that govern how groups think. And all the other thing that I haven't really talked about and sort of get short shrifted when we talk about cognition is emotion. And what the emotional meaning is of beliefs or group affiliation or that sort of thing. And so same thing I said about intervening with so-called radicals, it's really not about a cognitive remediation or doing psychotherapy or presenting people with facts or facts checking. It's about looking at whether it's the emotional forces or the social forces or the group affiliation forces that lead people into these closed groups that have these beliefs. What can we do to potentially disrupt that and give them other options that might be preferable? And when we look at people who have left, again, so-called radical groups, that's usually the key. Either they become disillusioned with the movement because they see cracks in it. We've certainly seen some evidence of that with QAnon. Or a group leader, when you talk about the Branch Davidians, I mean, that's its own terrible story. But the group leader is done something that makes them lose faith, lose the faith of their followers. Those are some of the things that steer them away. But the other way to steer them away is to give people other options, to talk to people who have left the movements and said, you know what, I used to believe the same thing you believed in, and until such and such happened. I think there's really very, very important things that I totally agree extend beyond just cognition.
On a related question from the audience, it sounds like isolation is a potential triggering factor, and you had even mentioned it before. Are there certain demographic characteristics or societal structure characteristics like the COVID pandemic and isolation into this space that contribute?
Yeah, I think that's an area of a fair amount of, I'll call it research or investigation right now. So I'm hesitant to say that we've made firm conclusions about that. I will say that anecdotally, that's certainly been part of the narrative out there, that particularly during the pandemic, people have been sequestered more. I mean, even today's lecture, right? I'm not there in front of an audience meeting you and going out for lunch afterwards. We're meeting through a computer screen. And that's really created or amplified a different kind of social interaction that we had before the pandemic, and certainly different than we had before the internet existed. So I think those forces are important to acknowledge.
And we've talked a bit about the recent effects of social media. I think it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on what lies ahead in the future, and are there any future trends that you can foresee happening? Are there any concerns you've got? Is there anything you're optimistic about that you can share with us?
I must say that I'm by nature more of a pessimist. And I'll also say when I go back to this what I refer to as the paradox of faith, I think one of the real lessons from psychology research is, again, that there are so many examples of beliefs that we have that we hold with unwarranted confidence. There are so many things that we believe in strongly that we really shouldn't believe in, or we shouldn't believe as strongly in. And so along those same lines, I pretty much never make future prognostications because oftentimes the pundits and the experts, that's one of the areas where they're often most wrong. And the world and human systems are chaotic enough that I think that's bad business. Now, beyond that, just what are my hunches? I mean, part of the reason I'm interested in this and I do the writing that I do is I do think this is a huge, huge problem. And I think even though I'm not a political scientist, I do a fair amount of political science reading and at times dialogue with people, academic colleagues who work in that department. I mean, I do have very significant concerns, and certainly in a place like the UK and certainly in a place like the US, about the implications of beliefs, misinformation, and democratic institutions. And I think there's significant reason to be concerned about moving into directions of more authoritarianism, where diversity of belief is not really a core feature of society. And I do see a lot of warning signs about that. As to what will happen, impossible to predict. I mean, even in a place like here in the US, I think that most liberals didn't think that Donald Trump was going to win the presidency. I think by the time he ran for re-election, many had conceded that he was probably going to win again. And both times they were wrong. And so who knows what's going to happen in another 3 years here? Who knows what's going to happen in the UK? So yeah, I won't prognosticate. I wouldn't say I'm feeling super optimistic about the future, but I think that part of navigating away from bad outcomes is, again, to talk more about these very issues and get people on a wider scale to understand really what's at play here.
So Joe, I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to say thank you for coming. Can you speak briefly about where we can find your writing and what you are going to be writing on next before we close?
Well, let's see. I'm actually, so you already plugged my blog. I appreciate that. That's Psych on
I think I have it on the slide here. Hold on, go ahead.
So that's it.
There's the link.
Psychology Today. That's really my effort to try to reach a wider audience. You know, I spent the bulk of my career writing academic papers and peer-reviewed journals, and some years ago I sort of shifted to try to reach a wider audience. So that's where most of that writing appears. I try to take some of the political writing I do to different venues. I am currently working on a book that touches on many of the themes that we've talked about. I've not yet found a publisher, so I don't know if that will ever reach the light of day. But if and when that gets published, I will definitely reach out to you all again to plug my book. But I appreciate the advertisement, as it were, and it's certainly something I'm very interested in and passionate about.
Well, I genuinely appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to hosting you here in 2023 for the actual in-person summit. I also want to acknowledge Anna's contribution as a moderator, and thanks, Mark, for joining us. And thank you, audience, for joining us too. Our next seminar is in February, and this one is interesting. This one will only be available in registration under Chatham House rule, because we will be speaking to Stephen Jolly, who is a professor and, more interestingly, a former senior British defense official who has commanded some propaganda campaigns. And so he will tell us about his involvement and the purpose and efficacy of propaganda. So thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and we look forward to seeing you in February. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Joe.